This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Some thought they wouldn't return. Many lost faith. But I didn't. I had all the confidence in the world that we were going to restore the Friday shows. All it took was actually having the time to comfortably sit back and watch a few hours of wrestling. That's why I love the holiday season. Yes, people, they've returned. It is the Friday installment of the Five Starr Wrestling Report. The new and improved format, I might add. It was a conscious decision to eliminate the world-class segments. Not really one that I was proud of, but it had to be done. It was becoming too much to handle. Too much wrestling to try to consume all throughout the week. And so I had to make a choice. And I decided that the world-class reviews are going to have to eat the bullet. So what you're seeing now as we move into 2026 is the official new Friday format. We've got Retro WCW and Retro Mid-South as the two primary Friday segments. That'll cut down on not only watch time, but also editing time. And it'll give me more time to thoroughly watch these shows and properly digest them instead of having to do a rush job. Because again, the goal isn't for me to just come on here and review the shows in a vacuum. I also like to try to provide historical context behind everything and share any tidbits of information that I might have. And I can make that a lot more manageable when we don't have to worry about 3 different segments. From now on, all I have to do is watch 2 hours of WCW and 45 minutes of Mid-South. And that I can handle. At least for now. So we kickstart a new Friday format here with a brand new year of classic content. But it's still the same show. And it's still the same podcast. The Five Starr Wrestling Report. The wrestling podcast no one knows but everyone needs. Make sure you subscribe, comment, and give the show a like. We are here on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays to bring you classic wrestling coverage. And it's a big one today. It's also been a hot minute since we sat down to cover anything with WCW or Mid-South. So we have a lot of catching up to do here, seeing as how we missed out on well over a month's worth of television. I know for a fact that I have a butt ton of notes for that Saturday night TBS show. So let's go ahead and kick things off with the syndicated WCW program. All right, here we go. Good to finally get back into the swing of these NWA recaps. We've officially made it to the 90s, ladies and gents. And when it comes to the state of WCW in 1990, well, it's kind of a double-edged sword, actually. Some historians would say it was a terrible year for the company. Others talk about it being one of the better years, especially when it came to the in-ring product. For me, especially as a kid growing up, there is a lot of nostalgia going back and watching a lot of these old tapes, seeing as how these were the kinds of first occurrences of me getting into wrestling and being exposed to the product from a young age. So yes, there's a preconceived bias that comes along with someone like me going back and doing these retro reviews of WCW. Bearing in mind that I'm now getting the opportunity to go back and watch these old shows with context and better knowledge about the inner workings of what was really going on at the time. It is a little different now with the adult brain mentality. You know, we talked a lot going back to the fall of '88, the Turner sale, the regime changes, everything that came as a result of the business turnover, Jim Herd, enough said. 1989 is what I would coin a frustrating year for WCW as a whole. It's a year that, despite every concerted effort the company made at trying to be a watered-down knockoff WWF Light, despite how bad things were when it came to the booking of a lot of the undercard, the ding-dongs, the Norman the Lunatics, the breakdancing Strongbow Kid, bringing back the Iron Sheik and sticking him in squash matches on live national cable TV. You know, we can still often overlook a lot of the bad gimmick ideas because you still had Flair and Funk. You still had Flair's Steamboat. You still had Luger Pillman. You still had notable standout periods during the year where you can go back and say, that's a moment worth reliving, or that's a moment worth rewatching again, or, you know, things weren't that terrible overall. It was only the tipping point for what would soon become the point of no return. Which brings me to 1990, where the Titanic officially hit the iceberg. Whereas with '89, you still had hope. You hadn't been completely insulted as a fan to where you just had enough and couldn't bear to even watch the ship sink. 1990 was the year where fans collectively said, enough is enough, we're tired of this crap, this is not the wrestling we grew up on, our intelligence has been insulted for the last time, we're done. You know, we already talked about house show attendance figures rapidly falling off a cliff right before Flair had taken the book in '89. By the following year, dude, I mean, the product was almost unrecognizable to anybody who hadn't been a longtime fan already. Jim Cornette's obviously spoken at length about the timeline of WCW in 1990. There's a whole kayfabe commentary series on it. So if you're looking for the quick elevator pitch of what went wrong, I mean, Corny's got all the deep dive knowledge, so go check out his podcasts. The only thing I'll say before we get going with this review, and this is something that apparently Christine Jarrett had quoted once upon a time during the Memphis Territory days, and it rings true. Wrestling fans are creatures of habit. It's true even to this day. We as wrestling fans put up with a lot of shit. We are most definitely creatures of habit. We will routinely tune in to watch virtually every single week at the exact same time on the exact same network stations, regardless of how good or bad things are. Because we are dedicated fans. We love this business. That is, until things get so bad that we finally throw in the towel and collectively decide that it's not worth the effort anymore. That is what happened to WCW in 1990. Between the loss of so much of the top talent, screwy booking up and down the card, turnover in booking committees and management, company morale being at an all-time low, fan intrigue hitting an all-time low, it was the year that sent WCW into a tailspin, the likes of which they never recovered until they finally managed to turn a profit again 7 years later. And because WCW was such a non-entity from 1990 till basically late 96, early 97, And we're talking what? 6-year period to where Vince McMahon basically had a monopolized balls grasp on pro wrestling. You wonder how fans in my age bracket got trained and warped to think that sports entertainment was the only kind of wrestling to ever exist? Well, y'all can thank Jim fucking Hurd for that one. Unless you were like me, watching old Crockett or Mid-Atlantic tapes or whatever territorial footage I could get my hands on growing up. I was one of the lucky ones. Because while yes, I also did watch the WWF as well, I certainly didn't view it as the be-all end-all like so many 90s fans did. I was blessed to have brothers that actually liked good pro wrestling. So I was fortunate enough not to get propagandized. But like I said, that's the end result of WCW running itself into the ground so badly that they had effectively made themselves irrelevant. And that book really began here in January of 1990. It was a dark year of history for the product. We're going to dive in with both feet because boy, do I hate so much of what this year represented in the overall scope of history. I almost got excited right at the beginning of the show when Teddy Long made the announcement about the debut of the newest skyscraper. That wasn't until he promptly mentioned that it was Sid being replaced and not Dan Spivey. Then I got bummed out because I meant I had to watch Dan Spivey wrestle later on. And while he did make his debut on this show, I'll go ahead and let the cat out of the bag now. This officially marked the debut of Mean Mark Callis, better known to many, myself included, as the future Undertaker, aka my number one favorite wrestler of all time, which I may or may have not already mentioned on this channel like 100 goddamn times previously. No shame. A lot of people might not even remember Taker's brief stint in WCW before he made his Survivor Series debut later this year. God, you want to talk about completely overhauling your look. I mean, he had just come from Memphis after breaking in about 2 or 3 years prior. And the sole reason for bringing him in the first place was because they needed a filler replacement for the skyscrapers. Because Lord knows Jim Herd couldn't go 5 fucking weeks without featuring the skyscrapers in any capacity. So the booking team got their heads together one day and said, "We need a 7-foot-tall motherfucker that can move and do moderately adequate big guy moves." Turns out the qualifications weren't all that high. I don't recollect who made the call to Dutch in Memphis, but I'm pretty sure he was the one who recommended Mark in the first place. Of course, imagine that. He excelled so well as an honorary member of the Skyscrapers. Took less than 10 months for Vince to get a hold of him and create the greatest gimmick of all time. It's amazing how things like that pan out when you're extremely talented. And or tall. So we begin the program with JR and Kevin Sullivan doing the cold open card rundown. Sullivan is dressed in a 3-piece suit. He informs us that he had a trip to Ireland recently postponed. In addition, he also traded in his Mercedes-Benz for a Rolls-Royce. Did I miss a storyline on TV where Kevin Sullivan came into a massive family inheritance? Where the fuck did he get all this money from? Moreover, did they ever explain what it was Sullivan was looking to do in Ireland? And why was this relevant to anything we saw during the remainder of the program? I don't think we ever got an answer. We did, however, get to watch Rick Fargo and Pat Rose versus the Steiners in the opener. Rick and Scott are the new World Tag Team Champions, in case you had recently forgotten that. When they beat the Freebirds on TV late last year to win the straps. I still remember. They are also building up a match between them and Doom for the upcoming Clash event in February. It is a title versus mask match where if Rick and Scott win, then Doom have to unmask at the end. You can already call that finish in your sleep. So the Steiners took turns throwing these guys around for a few minutes. I was a fan of the spot where Scott went to grab Rose around the waist like he was going to give him a belly-to-belly throw. And then right before the release, Pat gave him a few light taps on the wrist, probably as a means of him saying, "Please spare my life and don't throw me onto my head." And so Scott gave him a jawbreaker instead. The finish was even more amazing. Rick shoots one of them off. I think it was Pat Rose. Maybe it was Fargo. I don't even remember. What I do remember is you see the job guy run straight at Rick as he's about to catch him. And right before Rick gives him the release belly to belly, you can already see Rick begin to lean back while he is still waiting to catch the guy. When I first saw this, I'm like, dear God, he is about to spike this guy right on top of his head and kill him. And lo and behold, Rick proceeds to hit a flawless belly-to-belly suplex and not break the guy's neck. So I learned two things in the opening 5 minutes of this week's program. It pays to be really tall, and it also pays to be really fucking strong. And there is a lot you can say about the Steiner brothers, but you know what you can't deny about them? The fact that they were insanely strong men. I watched that replay over and over again, and it never got any less impressive. So following that, this is where Teddy Long did his pre-taped interview with Jim Ross to hype up Mark Callis' debut. The bigger focal point in the conversation, however, was whether or not the skyscraper replacement was temporary. To which Teddy basically said, "Sid Vicious works for me. So whenever he gets better, he may still have a job, or he may not. And if you know, you know." For the record, I still have no idea whether or not Sid was legitimately injured during this time. The track record of injury reports with the skyscrapers was always fluctuating. 1 week it was Sid who was hurt. Then a week later it was Spivey out with something. Most of the time they were so inane, you were starting to wonder whether or not they were actually injured or if they just didn't feel like going to that week's TV taping. You know who I know for a fact didn't want to show up to most TV tapings in the year 1990? Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express. These guys were beyond over it by this point. You could tell. They were out there to wrestle, pick up a paycheck, and that was about it. And occasionally steal the show to shove it back in Jim Herd's face. This was not one of those matches. Kind of hard to steal the show when your opponents are Paul Drake and Nasty Ned Brady. What was nasty about him? Aside from his physical appearance? Pretty much nothing. Oh, and lest I forget to mention this too. The Midnight Express, the formerly babyface tag team newly turned heel after they fucked the most hated babyface tag team of the 80s in the Dynamic Dudes, they come out here and get showered with nothing but admiration. These people knew the Midnights were heels. They said, "We don't care." So much so that they even drew attention to all the pro-Midnight signs in the crowd. And there were a handful of them. It is funny, too. The fact that right in the middle of this weird psychology dynamic where the people are supposed to hate the Midnights, but they're still getting wildly cheered. This is also right around the point where they're about to bring back the Rock and Roll Express and try to recapture that lightning in a bottle program. Makes you wonder how people are going to react when Ricky and Robert finally lock horns with Bobby and Stan on TV. Who do you cheer for in that scenario? And it's not to say I wasn't an advocate of seeing another Midnight Rock and Roll tag match in 1990. I think for a lot of fans, including myself, if you already knew about the rich history between the Midnights and the Rock and Roll, you probably look at something like that on paper and go, oh sure, I'm always down for another Midnight Rock and Roll program. In the overall metric of Midnight Rock and Roll matches, the one they had at Wrestle War, I'd probably rank that among one of the lesser memorable matches they've ever had. Keep in mind, this is already accounting for everything I've already seen between them and Mid-South and Crockett. You know, when they ran it back again in early 90, it was kind of hard to see it as anything other than what can we throw at the wall and see what sticks. Well, can't go wrong with another Midnight versus Rock and Roll match. Why not? It's not to say it didn't mean anything in 1990, but it wasn't exactly new or innovative from a booking standpoint either. It was going back to the well with something that worked in a previous regime when things were a lot harder and, let's be honest, both teams had more value to the product. Again, not criticizing the idea of revisiting the program, just I think we all instinctively knew why it was being done. I cannot say the same for anything involving Trucker Norman. Why anybody on the booking committee ever thought this is a good idea, I'd love to hear someone explain it. Because I thought the shit sucked. It was one thing to inexplicably turn Norman babyface when he wasn't getting over as a crazy, out-of-control inmate from the loony bin. So, yeah, naturally, turning him into a kid-loving, friendly inmate from the loony bin, that was surely going to work. Now we've reached the point to where someone decided, let's make him a trucker. A trucker, by the way, who loves to talk to stuffed animals and apparently likes to paint. I don't know who was responsible. I've heard rumors over the years that Ole may have been the one to spearhead it. I don't care who was involved with it. All I care is that it ever got past the office and made its way onto national cable television. That to me is even more egregious. As was this god-awful match between him and Bob Cook. Sucked. Nobody in the crowd gave a fuck. Every time Norman gave Cook a body slam, you could see his shirt riding up to expose his giant beer gut. My gag reflex kicked in every time I saw it. It went forever in a fucking decade, too. Norman did a bunch of boring offense and eventually won after he sat on Cook's face and squashed them. And that took us to Buzz Sawyer and the Dragon Master versus Rick Ryder and Ricky Nelson. During the match, JR was also running down the car for the following night's NWA main event. And I'm not even shitting you. This is how he directly plugged the car with a straight face. On that show, we were promised Norman the Lunatic presenting his self-portrait of woman, the Dynamic Dudes versus the New Zealand Militia, and to round all that absurdity out, beautiful Bobby Eaton will wrestle Ric Flair for the NWA World's Heavyweight title. Now here's the funny part too. I've seen that Bobby Eaton Ric Flair title match on Main Event. When I heard JR mention all the other stuff that was booked to happen on that show, it actually made me furious. I was like, you booked Eaton versus Flair for the World Heavyweight title on national television and decided you needed to have Norman the Lunatic and the Dynamic Dudes and other featured key spots on that same show? You fuckwits. They may as well have just said, all right, folks, set the record function on your VHS. Just fast forward to the last 15 to 20 minutes. Don't watch any of that other crap in between. If I can find that Flair-Eaton match somewhere, I might have to go give it its own separate review as part of next week's Friday show. Because that is by far one of my personal favorite Bobby Eaton matches to watch. Tag or singles. They actually had a match prior on a tape show in December. Can't remember if that was ever aired. I only remember seeing the one they had on the NWA main event show in January. Anyway, oh yeah, I guess there was a tag match going on here. Sawyer and Dragon Master won after beating up the Job Guys for several minutes. Really nothing notable from it aside from what it's all setting up in Corpus Christi in the cage, which isn't even so much about the cage match itself, but everything that happened to Sting in the process and how it completely fucked up their plans for the Wrestle War event. More on that later, though. Coming back from break, they showed the award presentation with Bill Apter alongside Gordon Solie, Scott Steiner, and Ric Flair. Solie had won the Editor's Award that year. Steiner won Most Improved Wrestler. Flair, unsurprisingly, won Wrestler of the Decade. It's, again, I talk about it all the time. Personally, never put a lot of stock in wrestling awards. I understand these presentations had a little bit of credibility back in the day when journalists were actually good at their jobs and weren't just looking to earn a quick buck by hanging onto the promoter's jockstrap. But they're artificial awards that are voted on by fans. I mean, they really don't mean anything unless you're someone that had a vested interest in these award presentations every year. Meaning that you're someone that got a ballot sent to you in the mail. Now it's just gone to a ridiculous point where they're making up new categories and throwing in names that no one's ever heard of before. So it means less and less now than it has at any other point in history. I'm just mostly tuning in to laugh and hear guys like Jim Cornette roast the absurdity of the year-end awards. Whether it's the Wrestling Observer, Sports Illustrated, whatever. They're all part of the same crap stew in my book. So then we had Flying Brian and the Z-Man taking on State Patrol. They had just recently put Zank and Pillman together as a tag team, coming out of that super white-hot Pillman-Luger feud over the U.S. title, which I thought was a massive mistake. Not trying to continue that program when it was still white-hot. And it's not to say I hated the Pillman-Zank tag team combo. I just wasn't a particular fan of it. To me, Pillman was always a cut above Z-Man on virtually every level as a worker. So I kind of dragged Pillman down as opposed to helping to elevate Zank to Pillman's level, if that makes any sense. You could even see during moments in this match where Pillman and Zank are doing these double team spots together. They were kind of clunky and mistimed because they really didn't have their chemistry down together yet. Frankly, I would argue they never had a ton of chemistry together, period. But that's just me. Like, there's a spot early on when the babyfaces are running wild. Zank goes to shoot Pillman off from the other corner because Pillman's supposed to do this big drop kick spot to one of the patrol guys on the top rope. But it's one of those awkward moments where, in order for Pillman to execute the spot correctly, he basically has to stop running so he can get himself in position to actually hit the drop kick. So I don't even know what the whole point of the shoot-off spot was for. And again, they're doing these really convoluted sequences where they're hitting the ropes and running at these breakneck paces, and it just looks really awkward and maladroit. Almost like they had a couple ideas on paper, but didn't really flesh out how they were going to execute everything. You know, I get they were young, but I don't know. Overall, it's not a bad match. They gave it some time because they really wanted to establish and put over Pillman and Zank as one of their newer babyface tag teams they were trying to push. So they did the whole babyface flurry heat comeback deal. Zank sold and took the beating so Pillman could run wild at the very end. Zank set up right for a power slam so Pillman could come off the top of the crossbody attack and get the pin, which they failed to capture on camera because they went to a crowd shot during the fucking pinfall. Because it's WCW, need I remind everyone. This just kind of feeds into more of that idea about them turning fans like me off in 1990. The whole Pillman Z-Man tag team. It wasn't the worst booking decision made throughout the year, not even close. But it wasn't something that I ever really liked or enjoyed watching. I mean, I can get behind the idea of wanting to build up some new tag teams. But to me, this always came across like WCW trying to make something happen with Tom Zank when the reality is they should have been throwing all their eggs into the Brian Pillman basket instead. Because while they were expending their energy trying to make Zank a star, they lost so much time with trying to make some money off of Pillman along the way. That's where I thought they made their biggest error. But again, hindsight is 20/20. It was still less offensive to watch than Rip Morgan and Jack Victory being a part of the royal family, managed by Lord Littlebrook. You heard that right. The former New Zealand militia, which, as of this current taping, was still apparently a thing. At least according to Jim Ross when he was plugging the NWA main event card. Meanwhile, on the same show, they come out in hour 2 dressed in tacky British garb that looked like they got it off the discount rack at the Halloween store. By the way, Lord Littlebrook showing up here in WCW to manage Victory and Morgan. It's about as random as it seems on paper. There was, to my knowledge, and I know we missed a month's worth of television, I don't think there was ever an explanation for how or why this occurred. I don't recall a single fucking thing these three ever did together on television. Pretty sure Littlebrook was gone from the company by the end of the year anyway. If he even made it that long. Just... Again, man, more bad, stupid gimmick ideas that were doomed to fail the minute they appeared on camera. It's not even anything against Rip Morgan or Jack Victory personally, but what the fuck, dude? You see them come out with these wacky get-ups. No one's going to take them seriously. We're supposed to buy that they're now part of British royalty. Yeah, Rip Morgan from New Zealand and Jack Victory from Long Island. Or wherever he was born. One of the suburbs of New Jersey. Ridiculous. Their work in the match was fine. I didn't even bother writing down who they wrestled. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello for all we know. They did some heat spots for a while and went over with a double gourd buster. To my knowledge, I don't think Littlebrook did anything outside trash talking at the camera and poking his cane at the ring. Oh, actually, that's not true. He stomped one of the job guys after the bell. And Kevin Sullivan laughed at it, which I don't think was supposed to happen. To me, Jack Victory was a lot more fun to watch when they were beating him in prelim matches on Dallas TV every week. Now that he's actually somebody they want me to take seriously as a threat, it's less fun to rag on him. So that brought us to the official debut of these Skyscrapers. Well, the Skyscrapers 2.0. It's Dan Spivey and Mean Mark Callis taking on the team of Agent Steel and Randy Harris. It actually hit me too when I saw Mark come out with Spivey here. When you really think about it, Sid and Spivey were not around that long as a tag team. Probably seemed like an eternity if you had to live through watching any of their matches. But generally, they were around together for what? Less than 6 months? It really wasn't that long in the grand scheme of things. And of course, Mark and Spivey weren't together as a tag team for that long either. Pretty sure Spivey's gone from WCW by the time the Bash season rolls around in early summer. He may have even left a little before that. I don't even remember. God, though, seeing Taker come out with not only red hair, but a fucking mullet. And a bad one at that. Dude. Still, he'd only been wrestling for what? A little over 2 years by this point? He was a hell of a lot more impressive than Dan fucking Spivey. Not that it was difficult to overstep that low bar. But now Mark was really good here, considering his experience level. Again, we always take for granted how agile he was. Even here in 1990, he could move like a freaking bear. He's hitting the ropes with max speed. Did the rope walk elbow drop at one point. It's no wonder he wound up signing with the WWF in less than 10 months. Guy was a future Hall of Famer the moment he got featured on the big screen. It was amazing, too. Like going back and watching this again now that Sid's out of the group, they were burying him hard on commentary all throughout the show. And they're talking about how Sid was the weak link in the chain, how Teddy made the right call bringing in Mark Callis to replace Sid because he wasn't reliable anymore. Sitting there like, Sid really must have pissed off somebody in the office to give the treatment like that. Did he try and cold cock Ole Anderson in the face one week? Not to say it was unjustified. I love Sid, but he was a handful to deal with, especially during this time. Spivey at the end mocking Sid's pose right before he gave the powerbomb to one of the jobbers. And then, of course, after they win, they do the promo hyping up this newest incarnation of the Skyscrapers. It is... well, it's a bad promo, first and foremost. Mainly because they decided to let Spivey and Callis talk instead of letting Teddy do all the verbiage. I could at least excuse Mark because he was inexperienced and had no idea what he was doing. Spivey, I mean, we all know how much he always sucked on the mic. The fact that they let him talk here, period, was beyond questionable. He tried to get across the idea that Sid was a good friend of his, but money is more important than friendship. How the Road Warriors were the team of the 80s, but the Skyscrapers will be recognized as the team of the 90s. To which I let out a hard belly laugh. It was, Yeah, like I said, a bad promo, but they got across what they needed to. It was funny, I have to admit, listening to fired up, angry voice cracking Mark Calloway. Especially having gone most of my life listening to him talk as the Undertaker gimmick. It was a bit of a mindfuck for a minute there. I almost forgot that he was a normal speaking Texan with a thick redneck accent. From there, we had Ric Flair doing a promo with JR. Well, it was interesting. They brought up the topic of Lex Luger looking to challenge for the World Heavyweight belt, which, as of this point, we all know was not the current plan for Wrestle War. That was still being originally planned for Sting versus Flair for the title, even though they hadn't turned on Sting yet. But with the way they were hyping up Luger here, you were almost getting the impression that that was the planned match. Luger-Flair. Kind of weird. But Flair talked about how he didn't dominate or carry the 80s. He survived the 80s. And as we transition into the new decade, the 90s will still be the year of the Horsemen. It's the symbol of excellence. It's what Flair lives and breathes by every day. And hey, you know what? He wasn't exactly wrong. Say what you want about the future incarnations of the Four Horsemen. I, for one, was not a particular fan of most of the future Four Horsemen teammates we ended up seeing over time. With that said, I mean, the group was around for, what, the next 6 or 7 years? I mean, they were still doing this shit well into 97, when it was Flair, Arn, Benoit, and Mongo. Pretty sure there were a couple other added members in between. But yeah, that Horseman thing, they ran the gamut with that over the next 6 to 7 years. So Flair wasn't wrong. You know who Flair was wrong about? Cactus Jack, a.k.a. Mick Foley, a.k.a. one of the individuals in the next TV match. There's actually a fun backstory when it comes to Cactus Jack in WCW, and it's a tale that JC's recounted many a time, so I'll let you go seek out his podcast to get a better picture. Here's what I will say, though. Even at this stage of Foley's career, having only been around pretty much a similar amount of time as Mark Calloway, 2 to 3 years, pretty much everyone on the booking committee during that time figured that Foley was going to be a big deal in the future, with the exception of 2 people, to my knowledge, Ole and Flair. And that's what ultimately led to Foley leaving WCW by mid-year, as opposed to becoming the breakout star he arguably should have been before he went to the WWF and became a household name and one of the megastars of the late 90s. And look, I have many things that I can and will eventually talk about with Mick, especially as we delve deeper into his run with the WWF during the Attitude Era. But one of the primary reasons they liked Foley so much during this time is that he was such a remarkable seller for all the top guys. They liked using him on TV because he was doing such a great job getting guys over. So they eventually offered him a contract after he was around doing jobs for a couple months. And one of the ways he was excelling in that field was giving guys the big elbow drop off the apron to the floor. They'd been working that into the TV shows where he would beat up his so-called partners after they lost their matches. And it would help to continue to get over Foley as this wild, out-of-control persona. And like I said, it was working to perfection until guys like Flair and Ole started criticizing his ring style and didn't really see anything in him beyond what he was currently doing. One of the rare Ric Flair misfires when it came to recognizing star power. And I guess it's always kind of been a critical divide amongst Flair and Foley fans. They didn't really see eye to eye on how the business should be conducted. I think they respected each other professionally, just, I don't know, mutual jealousy. And again, it's why Flair left a lot sooner than I think most people were expecting. I mean, he was smart enough to look around and see his value and decided he could get over somewhere else. That's exactly what happened. Of course, he was a standout during this match with him and Lee Scott taking on the Dynamic Dudes. The Dudes were the ones they were trying to put over. Meanwhile, Foley was the one who drew all the attention throughout the segment. Only thing I bothered to mention with the Dudes is them completely fucking up their finish here. I don't even know what they were trying to attempt. God, it looked horrible. Right as Johnny Ace went to pick up Scott in the sidewalk slam position, Shane Douglas hits the ring and drop kicks the guy straight out of Johnny's arms. And you could even see Johnny look at him like, dude, what the fuck? So they won, which no one cared about. Then Cactus, of course, beat up Scott afterward and left him for dead. It's a new year, but some things haven't changed between now and the previous several months. The Dynamic Dudes, still not over. Hard to believe, I know. Unlike the Rock and Roll Express, who I can promise you are most definitely over upon their return here. Sure, Robert Gibson had a little less hair since the last time we saw him, but they were still the Rock and Roll Express, baby. They, they cut a typical Rock and Roll Express white meat babyface promo. Ricky, of course, did the bulk of the talking, and Robert managed to mumble through some words and then quickly shut up so Ricky could take over. It was about what you'd expect. They said they were here to take on some of the toughest and baddest competition of the 90s. Ricky said they were here to kick some hiney, which I cringed at. It is one of those things where, had you not been following the timeline of Ricky and Robert's career in WCW, you see him return here in January of 90 and you're thinking, man, they must have been gone for a real long time. In actuality, they were gone from the NWA for, just a little over a year? When did they have their big contract blow up with Crockett? That was the fall of '88, right? Right before the Turner sale. So yeah, they left in the fall of '88. They went to the AWA and worked with the Midnight Rockers for a little bit. And by the time that business wrapped up, they were right back here in WCW to kickstart the thing with the Midnights. So it's not like they were gone for a long stretch of time. 15 to 16 months? That's a drop in the bucket by today's standards. Man, you'd have thought they took the CM Punk route and left professional wrestling altogether for the last decade, considering the response they got with the crowd here. Short and sweet to the point, though. Didn't overstay their welcome. They did their promo, and it was on to the next piece of business. It actually led us to the advertised TV main event. Hacksaw Higgins versus Dr. Death, which was a very odd match. Probably one of the more random matches you could possibly imagine. Actually, no. I can think of something even more random and unexpected. Case in point, Lee Scott doing a promo calling out Cactus Jack to a fight next week. I'm going to go on record right now. Poor bastard probably doesn't stand a chance. But hey, we'll find out in a week. So this main event, Higgins versus Dr. Death. The focal point of conversation here was, what does Dr. Death need to do in order to climb the ladder of success? What does he need to do in order to be a singles world champion in 1990? Well, according to Kevin Sullivan, he needs an equalizer, someone who can help him cheat. Thought that was humorous. After all the effort they've made at getting Williams over as a babyface, genius plan, he needs a heater. I mean, to be fair, relative to his success as a singles babyface versus when he was with the Varsity Club, kind of apples to oranges comparisons. The reality is Dr. Death needed a better contract to justify him sticking around longer so he didn't wind up going to Japan full-time for the next 2 or 3 years. This is basically a glorified squash, which might seem odd considering Williams was wrestling a guy around his same size. But he had some power moves on Higgins for a few minutes. Ended up going over with the Oklahoma Stampede. And again, the idea here is that they're supposed to be building to Dr. Death and Lex Luger for the U.S. title. Probably the match that was supposed to happen at Wrestle War, but... well, you know, plans change. I don't even know how much longer Steve stuck around following that pay-per-view. Wasn't long. I know that much. We followed that with a Lex Luger promo, who is now sporting his 5 o'clock shadow look. Glad to know that was only a temporary decision. He talked, boy did he ever. Luger talked and talked and talked for about 9 consecutive hours. Talked about how the 90s were destined for him to become world champion. He had mentioned all his previous accolades and all the major world titles he's won during the first 3 years of his career. The one championship that's evaded him, the one he's yet to get his hands on, the World Heavyweight title. And he vowed he would become world champion in 1990. As a heel. And while the prophecy came true, one could argue his world title reign was less than stellar, perhaps underwhelming. I guess you can also say the same about Sting when he finally won the belt at the Bash pay-per-view later this year. But at least Sting won the belt properly, as opposed to the overbooked clusterfuck that happened with Luger winning it in 91, but not actually having possession of the belt after all the drama that went down with Flair walking out with the original title. Complete mess. Anywho, I'm going to try and rapidly move through these next couple segments because we're already going long and I still need to get to Mid-South. Wildfire Tommy Rich was supposed to wrestle Agent Steel, but Cactus Jack came out and attacked Steel, which was the highlight of the segment for me. And while Tommy Rich versus Cactus Jack wasn't bad, again, we're well into hour 2 by this point. The last thing I wanted to be watching was a babyface in peril Tommy Rich match. It was merely passable as opposed to boring. It's probably the best I can say about it. Rich won with a sunset roll-up. And then Michael Hayes did a promo talking about how everyone's been proclaiming the 90s are going to be their decade. But Hayes is here to remind everyone what the Freebirds did in the 80s, not by talking about it, but by acting on it. When they turned the wrestling world upside down and created the most dominant group of the decade. He said the Freebirds will continue to ride high in 90, or throughout the 90s period. And right now, he and Jimmy Jam have a problem with Tom Zank and, quote, Fryin' Brian. Now, I'm pretty sure the Brian thing was a slip-up. When he referred to Jimmy Garvin as Jimmy Jam, I died a little bit inside. But yeah, called out Zank and Pillman and said the Freebirds are going to rearrange their pretty little faces. He also alluded to the fact that there are now 4 Freebirds, as opposed to 3. So we'll wait and see what he means with that ominous message. We then had the Wild Samoans taking on the Italian Stallion and Brody Chase. So they're out there doing stuff for a while. And in tags Brody Chase, seemingly for the final time of his career. I don't know what the hell happened here, but he and Samu tried this spot where Samu's going to give him this big arm drag takeover spot. Not necessarily the most difficult move to take, but it would at the bare minimum require Samu to call the spot ahead of time, considering who he was doing the spot with, because it basically involved him jumping over Brody's shoulders. Brody Chase, he did not get the message about this arm drag spot. Samu goes up. He tries to grab Brody's arm. Brody continues to stand there with dick in hand. And when Samu went to give Brody this arm drag, he leapt onto his shoulder, he came down, and he spiked Brody directly on top of his fucking head. I wrote, Concussion City. Get the gurney prepped and cart this guy off to the fucking morgue. He's done. And so for the next 3 minutes, the Samoans proceed to pound and pound and pound on the concussed Brody Chase. There is a point where JR is deliberately telling Nick Patrick, the official, to call the match off. Because he legitimately cannot take any bumps he's so out of it. But no. The Samoans just keep beating up this half-conscious job guy like nothing's wrong. I'm casually sitting there wondering to myself, how in the world has Patrick not stepped in to check on Brody? This guy is clearly in no condition to compete right now. He's just letting the match continue as if nothing's wrong. Finally, the Samoans win with a big splash. You know, in all fairness, I can't even exactly put all the blame on either party. It was a combination of Samu doing something completely unnecessary with a job guy who had no earthly clue what he was doing, and the simple fact that Brody Chase sucked. I'm mainly putting the blame on Nick Patrick for being the most incompetent official of all time. There's no way you can try and convince me he didn't know something was wrong. The fact that Brody could barely stand by the time the fucking match was over, that to me is even worse than Samu attempting a spot that he had no business attempting in the first place. What a complete disaster. I can't even in good faith laugh at Brody Chase for being the world's worst job guy, because he didn't do anything wrong here. He was just a victim of circumstance. concussion protocol, it was very different back in the day. But that left us with Sting and Arn Anderson versus the Galaxians in the main event. Oh, by the way, Arn, they spelled on the graphic as A-R-N-E. I have no explanation. Probably just a goof in the production room, but it was patently noticeable. God, you could even tell when they came out together. The idea that Sting and Arn were on the same team as tag partners, you always had to figure that was not going to be a long-term thing. Even before the execution of the turn on Sting later on. And in fact, as we all know, it wasn't even supposed to be in the original works, period. Because this was right when Tully and Arn finished up with the WWF and were supposed to both come back to WCW as partners. But then Tully failed the drug test and Jim Herd found out about it. So he rescinded the offer for both their contracts and ended up not taking Tully altogether. Ended up paying Arn like half of what he initially promised on the contract. So they both got fucked. I'm not sure who the Galaxians were here, but considering the way they were bumping for Sting and Arn, I was almost starting to think, hey, the Mulkeys are making a cameo. I'm almost positive it wasn't them, though. It was a fun squash. Sting and Arn took turns working him over. The Galaxians did some old school territorial chicken shit antics as they were getting beat up. Sting gave one of them a stinger splash in the corner, followed with Arn putting him away with a DDT. Still one of my favorite guys to watch get the DDT finish. I know everyone loves Jake Roberts' DDT. It's still great. But Double A, man, that guy could give a hell of a DDT. It's funny, too, because Arn and Sting's chemistry together as a short-term tag team is pretty damn good. Makes you wonder what would have happened had they tried to run with these two as a top babyface tag team throughout the 90s. Maybe would have given the Midnights a decent set of opponents to work with at some point. Maybe they would have stuck around longer. Anyway, I'm digressing. We did close out with a Flair, Ole Arn, and Sting promo, which was, again, just blatant foreshadowing for what was to come in the cage. I mean, they were telegraphing the hell out of that turn just by having Sting comment on Flair giving him the complimentary back rub. Sounded so disingenuous. It was still a good promo segment, don't get me wrong. Arn could still talk his ass off. No surprise there. He actually did the best job justifying Sting being a part of the group. Sure, they've had their differences in the past, but the Horsemen have always prided themselves on being the four supreme athletes and fighting with one common goal in mind, and that is to be the elite of this sport. And in order to do that, they had to take down Gary Hart's crew inside the cage in Corpus Christi. Also, complete sidebar here. Babyface Horseman. Still so weird to me. I know we're talking about a time frame when the fans were getting a lot smarter and the whole babyface heel dynamic was starting to get more and more arbitrary. But even seeing them throw up the 4 sign and talk about how great the fans are and supporting them, I don't know, dude. It's just odd to me. Babyface Ole Anderson. Enough said. Although he could still cut a hell of a babyface promo. All in all, show was pretty good when you consider how bleak things were about to get in the coming 10 to 11 months. At least you still had Flair on the booking committee by this point, so The shows weren't totally rotten. It is still a trudge to get through 2 straight hours of nothing but squash matches and moderately unimpressive promo segments. But that's kind of baked in with the format of these Saturday night shows. I mean, you can see what they're trying to set up for February, what they were initially trying to set up. Again, didn't go according to plan because of the Sting injury. But at least you could get an idea of a clear-cut path of what they wanted to do. It wasn't a complete guessing game like it was through a lot of the early to mid stages of '89. I know I made it seem like the entirety of 1990 was a complete bust. The early months, things weren't totally bad. But once Flair stepped down and Ole essentially took the book, it is baffling how quickly things spiraled out of control. I think this is the point where I realize my dates are never going to be accurate. The tape delay airings always throw me for a loop with Mid-South. Some sites will date the shows having aired on January 6th. Others I'm seeing are citing the original air dates as the 10th. I'm not 100% sure the day for this one is January 5th, but it's the one I'm rolling with. Now again, we've missed about a month of TV. Mid-South had just come off the big Christmas night event on the 25th. The Rock and Roll Express are the reigning tag team champions. And one match that we didn't really get to recap or follow up on was the big scaffold match between them and the Midnight Express, which ended up being the send-off for the Midnights right before they went to work in Dallas. So there's definitely been some talent turnover, which wasn't entirely uncommon during the territory days. A lot of talent turnover. So the Rock and Roll beat Hercules Hernandez and Ted DiBiase on Christmas night to win the Mid-South tag straps. And apparently Skandar Akbar's been pitching a fit over the decision. So we're waiting to see what he has to say on the matter. But after the whole opening monologue with Boyd and Cowboy Watts, who, by the way, was back from his beach trip to Hawaii, if there's anything more brain-rattling than a cowboy from Oklahoma surfing the waves of Hawaiian beaches, I don't know what is. But we get our opening match with Rick Oliver taking on the Iceman King Parsons, who had just returned to the Mid-South area not too long ago. He had a run-in with Kamala recently. He's also been having his share of conflicts with General Akbar, who's responsible for burning his face on Dallas TV, which is something I had totally forgotten about. As soon as Watts mentioned the fire angle with Akbar and Iceman, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. They did do a fire angle with those two, didn't they? I reviewed it. Yeah, not as memorable as Jim Cornette burning Ronnie Garvin's face in '87. Still, pretty notable moment in world-class history. So now the Iceman is back in Mid-South to allegedly finish up what Akbar started in Dallas. It's a good way to get revenge on someone who burned your face. I'll just follow them to the other territory and beat their ass there. Quick little squash win for Parsons. Ended up going over with a middle rope clothesline. This kind of turned into a coffee break segment so Watts could talk some more about the wrestlers he saw while he was on vacation. It wasn't just a chance for the cowboy to relax. Damn it, he's got talent scouting to do. A committed promoter if there ever was one. So then we came back for one of the best pre-taped interviews I've ever seen. It was so beyond preposterous, but it totally worked in the context of what they were trying to do. So here's a bit of backstory. Apparently, Hector and Chavo Guerrero were supposed to get a title shot when the Rock and Roll Express won the tag straps, but then they lost the belts to DiBiase and Hercules right before they won them back on Christmas night. So Hector and Chavo are expressing their anger over having been brought into Mid-South and promised a title shot, only for them to not deliver on that word. So they do this awesome Heat promo where they're dressed from head to toe in their native colors. Hector's got the fucking sombrero on. Chavo's holding up the giant Mexican flag banner. And they're going off on how they're being discriminated against. Their people are sick of seeing two Mexican athletes get overlooked in the American market. Chavo at one point acknowledges that he and Hector both have gone to the Louisiana ambassador to state their complaints over not receiving their shot for the Mid-South tag belts. Yes, we are to believe that in storyline, Chavo and Hector marched into the state ambassador's office to complain about them being racially discriminated against for not getting to wrestle for a pair of fake belts. That is why I still love professional wrestling. For incredibly ridiculous moments like that. Awesome stuff. And like the funny thing is, when you actually narrow it down, Hector and Chavo have a valid case. They were promised a title shot. The promotion has not delivered on that promise. What's their excuse? There really isn't one aside from their heels. So the promotion is going to look for any excuse to fuck around with them until the heels sue. Which is what Hector and Chavo vowed they would do if Mid-South keeps holding back. So we go to the ring for Hector and Chavo versus Tim Horner and Shawn Michaels. I liked how Watts tried to sell the audience on the idea that Hector and Chavo had been activists in the Mexican government. That apparently they've worked as advisors to try and ensure the Mexican government doesn't repay any interest on debt owed to the American banks after we allegedly stole funds from Mexico or something. Yes, Chavo and Hector working as government officials. Wonderful. I'd buy that in a heartbeat. I forgot how great these two were in Mid-South. Wish they would have stuck around longer than they did. It's a good little squash. Shawn and Tim weren't completely destroyed here. They still got some offense in. Shawn, I think, was trying to get in a little more offense than what Hector and Chavo were willing to sell for. So they quickly shut him down toward the end. But they won with their senton combo. Oh, by the way, that title match is slated to happen in 2 weeks. Apparently, Mid-South got a hold of those letters and said, not a hill worth dying on. Just give the Mexicans their title shot and be done with it. So then we had Terry Taylor versus Buddy Landel for the TV title. Landel had recently won the medal on television after beating, oh fuck. Who was the previous champion before Landel? I mean, they bounced that medal around like a pinball for the last 2 months. It's hard to track who's been the champion recently. First it was Crusher Khrushchev. Then it was Taylor. Then Taylor quickly lost it to Adrian Street via sexual molestation. I forget who won it from Street. Was it Taylor? And then Buddy had apparently beaten Taylor for it sometime in the last month. I don't know. A lot of moving parts there. Point is, it's Taylor versus Landel this week. As we know, Landel's saddled up with General Akbar as part of the army. He's his hired right hand. So they're out there trading some spots for a while. Lots of pinfall attempts from both guys. And about midway through, the Iceman makes his way down to ringside to be in Taylor's corner. It is mentioned that technically the Iceman doesn't have a manager's license. Therefore, he doesn't really have the authority to be down at ringside. Does the official do anything about it? You do the math. Oh yeah, also, the Iceman had his face burned by Akbar. You would think that the Iceman's first order of business would be to go chase the general around ringside. Maybe get his hands on him. No, apparently it was more important that the Iceman stay neutral. Make sure he didn't do anything to screw Taylor out of the medal. Now that right there is real friendship. What a class act from the Iceman King Parsons. So we get to the finish where they do the drop down spot. The ref is supposed to duck down so Taylor can step over him and get tripped up by Akbar when the ref's not paying attention. That, of course, leads to the Iceman chasing Akbar away while the ref's attention is still averted. Meanwhile, Buddy's got a visual pin on Terry. So Terry kicks out. And then they basically repeat the exact same spot a minute later. This time with the Iceman tripping up Buddy behind the official's back. And that is how Terry Taylor became the new television champion. It was kind of crafty. Although I'm not entirely sure about the idea of seeing the ref have to do 2 consecutive drop-down spots to avoid getting taken out by one of the wrestlers. Seems a little absurd. Other than that, fun little match. Most fans these days would probably scoff at the constant TV title changes we've been seeing in the last month or two. It is a little ridiculous. The hot potatoing of the TV title. But the story's always been about Terry trying to recapture the medal after having been deterred from it for so long. So the question is, does he hold on to it, or is Akbar going to try to argue to have the decision overturned? We'll see if Terry gets screwed again. And then we had Dr. Death and Ted DiBiase versus Hacksaw Duggan and Private Terry Daniels. God, Terry Daniels. Does anyone else remember when Watts tried to push that guy on Mid-South TV? Talk about something getting over like a wet fart in church. Not that I had anything against Daniels personally. I know he had that moderately successful run in the WWF in '84 when he showed up on Piper's Pit, and they did the whole thing with him and Sergeant Slaughter as the Cobra Corps, which was what it was. Guy was a fine athlete, but man, I'm just looking at the star power in the ring during this match. You got DiBiase, Steve Williams, Hacksaw Duggan. Then there's Terry Daniels, who looked like he got lost coming back from catering to find a seat in the crowd. He was just a very nondescript, plain-looking guy. I know he was a legit Marine, but doesn't mean he ever needed to be pushed as a top guy in Mid-South. Thankfully, that experiment didn't last all too long. Pretty soon they put him back in prelim bouts where he mostly belonged. So they established earlier that Dr. Death was no longer permitted to bring out his football helmet. They've added it to the list of outlaw gimmicks in Mid-South, along with the chain, the chair, the tennis racket, and the 2x4. They mention nothing about DiBiase and the loaded glove. A little bit of foreshadowing for the finish here. The match, I would say, is generally going along fine. People were really into it when Duggan was in there blistering the heels and they were bumping around and selling like crazy. And then things kind of fell apart toward the finish. So there's supposed to be a spot where Duggan is going to knee DiBiase in the kidney area during a shoot-off spot with Daniels. And I don't know if Duggan just completely forgot or if there was a miscue on when the spot was supposed to take place. But you see Daniels shoot him off. DiBiase runs toward the direction of Duggan's knee. And, well, DiBiase sells like he was kicked in the kidneys. But you never actually see Duggan make contact with him. There's a momentary pause. And then they do the old-fashioned grab a hold spot where DiBiase's in a headlock for about 30 seconds talking to Terry so they can run back the same deal. And they do. It was patently obvious by that point that Duggan completely blew the spot the first go-around. But it was a crucial part to the match because it set up the four-way brawl, which then set up DiBiase loading up the glove so he could hit Daniels with it. And then Dr. Death stole the pin. Not a very fluid execution there, but it sort of got the job done. It is kind of boneheaded logic on the promotion's part to just assume that DiBiase isn't going to try to load up his glove with a gimmick. We've seen him do it time and time again throughout the years. You would think, if they're going to go out of their way to ban the football helmet, wouldn't common sense dictate maybe we should ban the glove too? I don't know. Guess it's the nitpicky side of me talking. So that brought us to Brad Armstrong versus Sheik Hercules Hernandez. Brad Armstrong, the North American champion, by the way. Another recent title change on Mid-South TV in the last month. I think that was basically the company's way of saying, well, shit. We lost Magnum TA to Crockett. Can we get a hold of another young, good-looking kid to put the title on? And fast? Well, cue Brad Armstrong. He definitely fit the bill of young and good-looking. Not necessarily somebody I would have put my top regional world title on, but not my company. That being said, boy could Brad work. Guy was a hell of an athlete. They followed a very simple big guy, little guy formula to this match. Not that Brad was necessarily littler. Definitely smaller than Hercules. But Brad controlled the pace early on. They did a spot where Hercules cut him off in the corner and worked him over for the heat. And as Hercules tried to put his Cobra Clutch finish on Brad, they did this unique little deal where Brad used Akbar as a wall to kick himself out of the hold. Of course, in the process, Pee Wee Anderson also went down. So when Akbar went to run interference on Hercules' behalf, outruns King Parsons to yet again get involved. Second time on the same show. He shoves Hercules off the top rope, which gave Brad the chance to capitalize. But then everyone just hits the ring for the DQ anyway. I'm pretty sure it was non-title, but it was good to see they didn't just outright beat Hercules flat here after the Iceman interfered. I know I've been very hypercritical about Brad Armstrong in the past. He's just always been a tough nut for me to crack. He had so many of the tools that screamed, this guy should be a top babyface for any major wrestling organization in the country. But man, I think back to so many of those TBS shows in 86, 87 when Brad was out there wrestling squash matches every week. And he's just doing these long, drawn-out chain holds. And God, there was just nothing to any of his segments. His promos were lame. His matches were lame. I just got so fed up with having to watch him wrestle boring 10-minute squashes every week. I started to hate him after a while. And it wasn't his fault. That's the thing that sucks. He was doing what he got paid to do. God, it was just so lifeless, though. Now, him coming back to Mid-South in 85 was a good move for his career. I know he went back to Southeastern at some point right before he went to work for Crockett in the next year. So again, kind of like a lot of guys around this time, didn't have the longest run in the territory, but him showing up and beating Ernie Ladd for the North American title as quickly as he did shows that he had a lot of potential. Shows that Watts put a lot of stock in him. And he'd already been wrestling for, several years? He was one of them seasoned vets by now. I hate that terminology. Such a boomer thing to say. He's a seasoned vet. Get the fuck out of here. But anyway, that left us with a quick series of standby matches. We had Kamala going over David Diamond, which was harmless enough. And we also had Jake Roberts going over Rocky King, which, again, wasn't much to write home about. Although I've been on record saying that Jake's run in 85 with Mid-South was one of the key parts that put him on the map as a future Hall of Famer. If you haven't seen footage of Jake the Snake in Mid-South in 85, oh, get ready. This is a breakout year for his career. But yeah, that was the show. We'll go ahead and close the book on this week's installment. Pretty good Mid-South episode this week. Very wrestling heavy, which I was okay with. 1985, another relatively successful year for Watts in the Mid-South region. For me, 84 was still more fun to watch on the whole. There was a lot more memorable stuff that happened that year. But they carried a lot of momentum forward. And considering how the landscape of the wrestling business was quickly changing, especially with Vince going national now, I mean, we're still technically in what we would consider one of the down periods of the territories. We've already been heading that direction over the last year. But you still had pockets of great moments throughout 85 where the territories were running strong, despite how things were rapidly changing in the field. But there you have it. Again, it's good to be back doing this Friday show again. It's still going to be a little hectic for a while, but I'd like to try to maintain this format for as long as I possibly can. And again, I think cutting back on the world-class reviews is going to do me a huge service. Because yeah, the show was long, but it's just so much easier to watch 2 episodes of wrestling instead of having to do 3. It's actually 4, because I watched Retro Raw over the weekend as well, and again, that's really the only time I had to sit down and actually watch all this stuff. Got to do it on Friday night and Saturday afternoon. But yeah, speaking of that, I'll watch Retro Raw at some point tomorrow. I still got time though. I'm off this week, so it's a little bit of a laid-back schedule for once. And then the pandemonium kickstarts in the next week. I'm looking forward to it. On that note though, folks, thanks for coming back to check out the FSWR show. And we will reconvene on Monday. Talk to you all soon, and take care. Peace out.